Up until the 20th century, ethical theories were predominantly derived from one of the three main traditions: virtue ethics, based on the Aristotelian school, which focused on character development toward being virtuous; deontology, associated with Kant and Plato, encompassing all moral theories focusing on principles and values; and finally, consequentialism, based on the utilitarian model of the best results for the greatest number of people. But in the early 1900s, George Edward Moore, one of the founders of the analytic tradition alongside Bertrand Russell, while debating and defending his consequentialist theory, inadvertently developed a novel manner to deal with ethics in philosophy. Not another school of thought intending to define what is right or wrong, but rather an attempt to identify how we can talk about ethical subjects in general, the field of metaethics. Much like metaphysics, which studies the existential structure of the objects that physics studies in the world, metaethics attempts to understand the basis of moral phenomena without arriving at any value judgment. Instead of saying that X is morally good or bad, it tries to analyze how people arrive at such a decision and what it means to be morally good or virtuous or not. In this tutorial, we will take a look at how metaethics was established by Moore and developed until recent decades, setting a new stage for the traditional ethical theories to expand further into uncharted territory. Moore defended an intuitionist impersonal consequentialism. This means he defended the idea that which was inherently good could only be assessed by intuition, as it would not be something you can simply identify objectively. Intuition should not be understood, as the mystical or religious use the term, as an extra faculty about a hidden reality, but rather as a way to obtain direct and simple knowledge, a mistaken interpretation that John Mackey would later attribute to intuitionist theories of morality. So this interpretation of good is quite singular, unlike everyday uses of good, such as with good food, good night, and so on. The definition of a moral good cannot be identified as a single object in the world, but only found within specific contexts. Moral goodness, then, would only be assessed intuitively in a holistic relationship with whatever actually involved it. One would not say that the treeness of a tree lies solely in its leaves, branches, trunk, or roots, but only when all the parts are present. This also happens with good in his perspective. One can consider a good action, but one can never isolate a part of it and say the precise action of carrying the bags of that elderly lady to help her cross the street is what made the entire action morally good. Moral goodness is strictly inherent in what we intuitively identify as good, so it's not a separate object we can merely associate with other things to make or identify them as good. Thus, good itself is undefinable, only identifiable through our unmediated intuition within the context in which it appears. We can make a further analogy with colors. You can immediately identify the color yellow when you see it, but it's hard to define or say anything more about it. The same thing happens with morally good action. You know it when you see it, but there's often little else we can say about it. Moore's understanding of moral good can then be defined as something having intrinsic value. Therefore, he is not a subjectivist. As for him, goodness is real. It exists in the world. It simply cannot be reduced specifically to something within it. He advances this conception as he criticizes what was ethical naturalism back in the late 19th century as defined by Spencer. As we saw previously, Spencer's theory had several flaws in interpreting and adapting Darwin to a proper philosophical, ethical, and political theory, but some of those errors were exaggerated by critics, especially by Moore. Not only that, but Moore also confused himself thoroughly in his criticism. To criticize Spencer and the moral naturalism he represented, he coined two concepts which he sometimes used differently but other times interchangeably, to his and his readers' confusion to this day. Those are the naturalistic fallacy and the open question argument, either or both of which are frequently confused with Hume's is-ought gap, or Hume's law. To save us some time, an explanation where he recognized his confusion and helped clarify what he originally meant was posthumously published 90 years after the original 1903 publication of his major ethical work, where these ideas were first presented, Principia Ethica, a title analogous to Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, as we saw previously. To commit the naturalistic fallacy, one has to commit any or all of these errors. First, confusing different logical types by taking a class as a member of itself, such as looking for the campus in its individual university buildings, or claiming that the number 7 is green, known today as a category mistake in logic. Second, identifying good with anything, for when you do so, you can always question, but is that good? And it will always make sense to do so, which leads back to good being undefinable. This is the famous open question argument, a very weak argument, since, for example, bank is not undefinable just because it has multiple different meanings: money bank, river bank, and so forth. The same goes for any word which changes its meaning throughout time. Third, and actually reminiscent of Hume's law, would be to proceed in an inference involving any of the previous two, that is, to derive a conclusion in a logical argument that presupposes or arrives at a category mistake or an open question argument. Therefore, naturalistic actually applies to natural objects in the logical sense, as the smallest unit of information, such as chair, green, or X, and not necessarily to moral naturalism. Though extremely crude and confusing, as he himself recognized, More's analysis of what constitutes what we call good generated an impactful wave in ethics, and along with the analytic linguistic turn, he helped to generate, with his approach to morality focused on language, what would be one of the largest emerging schools of thought in contemporary philosophy, that of metaethics. Afterwards, he then goes on to defend consequentialism based on an impartial evaluation of the greater good, as defined by him, for the most people. This opened up a wave of new classifications for ethical theories. Regarding the reality of moral judgment, More, for example, was a realist, because even though you cannot reduce the good to any other metaphysical properties in the world, it still exists and can be measured through pleasure and pain. Hume, on the other hand, would be an anti-realist, because moral distinctions are generated by our emotions subjectively, and so the property of being good isn't ontologically objective at all. Thus, he is also a non-cognitivist, meaning that when we utter moral sentences, they are a result of this emotional expression and are not to be judged as true or false. They simply are. A traditionally cognitivist position would be Kant's, as when one checks their action against his version of a golden rule, also known as the categorical imperative, their course of action is objectively true, while if it doesn't, then it is false. Metaethics therefore differs from normative ethics, as it does not attempt to create any moral norms as laws or values, only attempting to understand how we define moral goodness, what motivates us, and all the other characteristics of ethical behavior in a descriptive manner. Without noticing, More divided the ethicist's job into two different tasks: explaining moral concepts and prescribing what is morally desirable. Ironically, most of ethical naturalism, the object of More's criticism, does not commit the naturalistic fallacy, as it developed into a strong metaethical position, not attempting then to set any moral norms. Of course, we can trace metaethics back to even some early writings in ancient philosophy, and throughout the history of philosophy itself, as many authors attempted to understand moral phenomena before trying to theorize what morality should be, like when Aristotle wrote on human nature, when Kant discussed our mental faculties in order to assess our moral prowess, and so forth. But never before More had this level of categorical scrutiny been applied in order for this type of philosophical endeavor to rise so quickly. In the next tutorial, we'll take a look into some main normative and metaethical positions in contemporary ethics as they developed in the 20th century after More.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.